programmed a break for us.
Perfect.
We'll do part 1 and part 2.
Thank you.
We have a punch clock.
There you
We'll
go.
just have him punch in when he gets here, then we'll have to tell him to punch back out, wait a few minutes, and
No,
punch back.
Red light is on.
That's not how time management works at his level. No. All right. Given the red dot is on, I will open this workshop for tonight's meeting.
All right.
Do we do the pledge at this point, or
We'll do the roll call and pledge. Yeah.
All right. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Back to you, Twyla.
And Councilor Albert is excused.
Yes, I need a motion
Make
for
a motion to
excuse.
excuse him.
Second.
Can we make the second as well with Cassie,
Who's
who is
Cassie?
also ill?
Yeah, I make that motion also.
Yes.
Second is agreeable.
Okay.
All in favor?
Order passed 4-0.
We'll have enough to keep us going, right?
Right.
Councilor Ganong,
Here.
Councilor La Rochelle,
Here.
Councilor Ward,
Here.
Councilor Lunt,
Here.
and Councilor Fellows.
Here.
All right. And the first item is the workshop council training session with Attorney Dan Stockford.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
I have materials to hand out. Thank you. Was that, did you move to go to workshop? Is that what you did?
Thank you, sir.
Alan,
What was that?
did you move to go to workshop?
I need a motion to go to workshop.
I make the motion that we go to a workshop.
Second that.
All in favor?
5-0.
Thank you. Point of order. Appreciate it.
So I've handed out a packet of material that I'll be referring to as part of this session. Just to explain to you what's in the packet. The first is it's really a slide deck of the topics that I'll be covering. And then attached to that are 2 documents. One is a Maine Freedom of Access Act summary, which is taken from the state website. That is the material that, as public officials, you're responsible for reviewing as part of your Freedom of Access Act training. And that's required by state law. And then the second document is simply a publication by the Maine Human Rights Commission addressing sexual harassment issues, and I'm going to be touching at the end of my presentation on harassment issues. Because I understand that as municipal officials, you participate in the online training that the town has for sexual harassment. I won't use this session to go over a full coverage of harassment and discrimination issues, but I've included some slides at the end that touch on them, and I'll talk a little bit about the requirement that municipal officials and employees have that training. So the topics that I'd like to cover are first roles and responsibilities of the council and management and town staff under the town charter. Second, I'll touch upon conflict of interest issues under state law and the Lisbon Town Ordinance, Code of Ethics. I will cover Freedom of Access Act issues on a selected basis. Because you participate in the online training, I won't go into an exhaustive discussion of Freedom of Access Act issues, but there are there are some key points that I'd like to cover. And then finally, as I mentioned, harassment and discrimination, we'll touch on those as well. So the town charter sets out in some detail what the respective roles of the council and the town manager and staff have in town government, and makes very clear that vested in this council are all legislative powers associated with the town. That includes enactment of ordinances, regulations, resolutions, and orders. You are the policy-making body for the town, so you establish policy for the conduct of town government, and as part of the online ordinances, there are a number of policies that are in effect, including the personnel policy and other policies. You're also responsible for adopting rules of conduct for town employees and for the establishment of town government. I would point out that as a public body, the authority of the council really rests in your constitution as a body. Individual council members don't themselves have any unique powers unless they're either set forth in the charter or they're specifically delegated by vote of town council. So, for example, if an individual town councilor wanted to review a employee personnel file, which is not a public document generally, you wouldn't have the ability to simply come into the town office and do that. The council could, as part of its authority over town government, and for a proper purpose, decide that there are confidential documents that individual council members can or should review as part of your oversight responsibilities. But in some, I've had boards in other communities that an individual board member will be elected, and they think they've got a lot of sway and can kind of do whatever they want. And I don't want to burst your bubble if that's your belief. I doubt that's your belief, but you really are, your authority rests as a member of the council, and what the council decides, your proper authority is.
Is it different with a select board? It's different with a select board, is it not?
In a select board, town you're talking about a municipality that doesn't have a town manager form of government, but the select board. I agree that there definitely are differences, and in some small towns, select board members take on much more of a sort of direct oversight authority over town employees and officials, and your charter, very specifically prescribes that as councilors you don't interact directly with town staff. The town manager reports to you, and then you rely on the town manager to oversee staff. So I'll cover that in a little more detail, but you're absolutely right, Don, that in a select board type of community, it can be a bit different.
Actually, I think he may cover it later on, and all I was going to say is, to the point, the example you were making, I mean, as a council, it would be a pretty rare circumstance, which, as a council, we'd be looking at any personnel type of
Absolutely.
files anyways. I mean, our role would basically be stopping at the town manager versus the idea. I mean, is there really ever much of a circumstance where we would actually, as a group, be actually diving into a personnel file? I mean, it'd be very unusual.
Right. That would be extremely unusual.
Okay,
and
great.
Really, the only authority that the charter prescribes where that might happen is there is an investigative authority under the charter. So you have the authority to investigate the conduct of individual town departments, and you also have the authority to adopt rules of procedure for that.
Which is good to hear, because I mean, it's just one of those things I know of a concern of Diane's and of the town, in a sense, in the past years. There's actually been kind of probably a misunderstood level of where we play when it comes to personnel, which really is zero in a sense.
Yeah.
My feeling is, and that's why I was just, you use that for an example, but
It
it was one
probably
of those
wasn't
things
a
where I
good
just wanted to
example
make
because
sure that
it would be such an unusual circumstance where that would occur.
Exactly, yeah.
And And it's important that, not only you, but the public understands that, because,
Correct, yeah.
I think sometimes citizens think that as a member of the council, you have,
Right.
superpowers, and, they'll come to you with a complaint and then not understand, why
The process,
you can't
yeah.
immediately address it. But
Thank you.
that's absolutely right. It would be extremely unusual for that to occur.
Dan, down later in your presentation, do you cover clearly chain of command?
I
If not,
will.
can we you will.
Yeah,
Okay.
I will touch on it. Yeah, I will.
I know
because
that's,
there's
I
very
know
specific-
that's played out, so I
Yeah,
want to make
there's
sure.
very
that was-
specific language in the
Okay.
charter on that, so
Good.
I'll touch on that.
Thank you.
So talking about, we talked about you're really a legislative policy-making body, and then the town manager and the staff are really the administrative authority in the town. The council provides that administrative powers are vested in the town manager and town staff, and that they're responsible for carrying out administratively the policies that you adopt as the council. I've got a little side-by-side slide that shows key roles of the council and manager, and this is sort of a summary of some of the key roles that each party or entity plays. Really, the town manager is the chief executive officer. The town manager is responsible in implementing and enforcing your policy, ordinances, and orders. While you select the town manager and you evaluate the town manager, so the town manager is your direct report, but no other employees of the town report to you. All other employees of the town report to the manager. You do have a role in confirming specific department head appointments, and I've listed them here. The town clerk under the charter, police chief, fire chief, public works director, finance director, tax assessor, and the town treasurer, tax collector. Those are all appointments that the town manager makes the appointment, but in order for it to go into effect, you need to confirm it. All other employment positions in the town are appointed exclusively by the town manager or the department head with the authority of the town manager. Now, while you have the authority to confirm those appointments for those specified department heads, it's the town manager that has the authority to remove those positions. Those positions don't come back to you for a decision if there's a decision to terminate or remove those appointments. You can establish and prescribe the
Dan,
functions.
quick
Sure.
question on that.
Yeah.
Any of those other non-listed positions here, does that cover salary, or is that still policy? So
Do you have
we're hiring a new position in this public works. The fact is, does that fall under policy, or does that the discretion of either the public works director or town manager?
Salary, you mean?
Salary
Well,
for a
at
hire.
the end of the budget, I think,
yeah.
I think we budget the money.
Right.
meaning do
But we
you
typically-
determine the salary?
Yeah.
Individually.
I think the town my answer is the town manager determines the salary, but has to do it within the
Budgetary constraints that we hit.
that you prescribe.
And
Exactly.
nothing more, nothing less.
Correct.
That's why I was asking.
Right, they could have one less
Yeah.
person and pay somebody else more kind
Right.
of thing, as long as it fits under the budget cap.
Yeah.
Okay.
So obviously the town manager has, in setting the salary, has to operate within the parameters that you've
Right.
established.
We established the budget, but at that point, it's
Yep.
an administrative function
Exactly.
associated with what she's empowered to do.
Correct.
That's the
Correct.
point I was going after.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. As I said, you have the authority to investigate the affairs of the town or the conduct of town departments. That would be extraordinarily rare, while that authority exists in the charter, and it exists in other charters and municipalities that we represent. In my experience, I haven't seen a council actually use that authority. But it's there. It's important. If there was an extraordinary circumstance, you would have the ability to trigger that. And as I said, the way the charter is worded is, you are supposed to adopt rules of procedure for doing that. I'm not sure. I don't know that there's anything in the charter currently with
So I
rules
was
of
wondering, is
procedure.
there actually a set of standards or actually guidelines for that, or is that basically a kind of a, I mean, I would assume at that point in time, the council would actually be working with legal at some
Exactly.
level to actually
Exactly, yeah.
move that forward.
Yeah, I think what you'd want to do is meet with the town attorney and
Yeah.
figure out
Something
rules
gets to that
and
level.
a
exactly, yeah.
process for proceeding on that basis.
Question for you on that, is that actually, and not implying anything, but does that actually, would the school department be part of that town department, or would that be a separate entity if there was actually ever a concern? Would that fall under that same standard?
That's a good question. I think under the charter, it doesn't exclude the school department from that. There may be some legal issues around what is the extent of your authority with
We just
respect
found
to
in past years, there's a lot of loose-ended type of connections between the school and the town. I was just wondering if that actually falls within that or not.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I think we'd if you were contemplating going down that road, we'd want to have a discussion, because under Maine law gives very specific authority to school committees, and there's a question about the extent to which by charter a municipality can.
I think that
supersede
the town council always should have enough working relationships with the school board that they could meet one-on-one and actually determine that anyway, so they wouldn't want to overstep their boundaries. But I was just curious if that falls in. Now, how about the, and we've run this in the past, where the water department, as much as it's its own entity, does that actually fall within that also?
Well,
Or-
I think you would have some authority with respect to the town, with respect to the water department. But because they have their own charter,
Yeah.
we'd have to figure out where the line is drawn with respect
I
to
know in
your-
their charter, there's some things that are delegated to the town or
Yeah.
acknowledged as rights of the town, and some that they,
Yeah, just legally.
Yeah, we'd have to kind of
Yeah.
look at both charters and,
Yeah, and the odds are it never becomes a circumstance, but I know we are attached legally to a certain level when it comes to financials and stuff. But.
Yeah. You adopt the budget, the administrator prepares it and presents it to you for consideration. I don't have it listed here, but you're responsible for signing warrants, and you have a policy or policies that address when you need a majority of the council to sign warrants and when a single councilor can sign a warrant. And under your existing policy, generally you have delegated to you've created the ability, consistent with state law, for an individual councilor to sign certain warrants. That would be for disbursement of state fees, for compensation of town employees, and compensation of school department employees. The school department policy is an individual councilor can approve a warrant as long as a majority of the school committee has approved the warrant first.
And not to be long-winded on that either, just a question. I mean, we actually sign warrants. I mean, council has to do, and a lot of times we'll come in and we'll sign a warrant, and it's really impossible for us to know the full
what you're signing.
depth of the warrant. You know what I mean? Because there's a lot of numbers there. I mean, without actually sitting there for 3 hours going through and actually, what is the liability or the level of how could a councilor be held accountable if there is actually a huge problem with that warrant? I mean, that actually something was come down, and I assume they probably never would be, but just always kind of, our signatures need to be there for a reason, but I mean, if there was something that was signed that was just grossly a big concern, I mean, would an individual member, I mean, is there any accountability, I guess?
I don't believe that you would have personal financial liability for it, but I would need to to research that question.
I always kind of wondered that, you
No,
sign your name and you're like,
to your point, unless it's a payroll warrant, I will read the content.
Yeah.
Because it does have my name on it. So the fact is, there is liability associated.
There's just a lot of times there's a lot of information in the warrant. And not actually having a full, working understanding of what's in there sometimes.
Yeah, it's a good question.
We actually sign it with the trust of the people that actually are presenting it. That it's actually complete without actually, doing a full audit on ourselves. But I always kind of wondered when you sign, what as a member, what.
Right.
What would happen if there was a big problem with that?
Right. Yeah, and I apologize, I don't have the answer to that question off the top of my head, but...
Which is good to know, because it's probably never happened yet if you don't have the answer, which is actually a good thing, right?
Exactly. So, as far as the chain of command, I've got a few slides on that issue, but the charter provides that, except for confirming appointments of certain employees, neither the council nor any of its members shall in any manner dictate the appointment or removal of any town administrative officers or employees within the jurisdiction of the town manager or his or her subordinates. So basically, you can't make a decision about terminating or appointing subordinate employees that are subordinate to the town manager. It does provide, though, interestingly, that you may express your views and fully and freely discuss with the manager anything pertaining to appointment and removal of such officers and employees. So you have the ability to share your thoughts with the town manager, and because the town manager reports to you, obviously, whether the town manager accepts your thoughts,
But this goes back to the point you made earlier, that you're saying the council as a group,
Right.
not a councilor as an individual, right? So if there's a concern, it should actually be addressed at the council, meaning
it should be right.
the body.
As an individual, you really don't have the ability to. You shouldn't be going to
and actually complaining. As a council, as a
but
body.
as a council,
then,
you could work together to.
I just think that's an
express those
important point to actually bring up, is it's not, we're nobody without the body or the majority. It's actually just individuals shouldn't be
And
involved.
I think you'd want to be judicious, obviously, in exercising that authority, because employees have confidentiality rights too. So you would
It
want
looks horrible on camera to the
It
public
certainly
eye.
does, yeah. But
And it's highly slanderous if you can't substantiate it.
Yeah, exactly. So if there's an issue, you have the right to go into executive session to discuss that issue. And so I would urge members of the council to avoid sort of criticizing in a public forum
But it's also,
the conduct of individual employees.
it's not so much of a concern, though, as if an individual member would to express a concern to the chair and have the chair actually present the concern to the manager off the record, right, in a sense? Maybe not doing it in public, but if there was a concern,
That's kind of where I was going with the chain of command thing. It'd be like, if I had an issue, and because I used it before, PW, I am not going to go directly to PW, go to Diane to be able to initiate something with PW. That's the command, because when a counselor presents himself to a department head, they're in an awkward position, already elevated, because they're wanting to do the right thing, and you're bypassed the first part for Diane to be able to exercise that same issue.
And that could be considered a conflict of interest, I would think.
Yes, you are misrepresenting yourself.
Yeah, and the next slide really covers that directly with specific charter language. The charter provides that council and its members shall deal with town officers and employees who are subject to the direction and supervision of the manager solely through the manager. So you are prohibited by the charter from directing or giving orders to individual employees other than the manager herself who reports to you. So, and that is really the charter incorporates the provisions of state law on that very topic. Law addressing the town manager form of government has the same language, basically, that council members don't deal directly with town employees other than the employee they supervise. So my final slide on this topic is just addresses sort of best practices. You really you have a CEO. You're a board, and you generally need to rely on the CEO to be able to sustain the organization. To the extent that you have questions or concerns about how the town's being operated, you generally should address those to the town manager and rely on the town manager for to address those issues with employees. And by the same token, employees who have concerns shouldn't be coming directly to you. They generally should be following the chain of command, going to their department head, up to the town manager, and then as a last resort, it would come to your attention. So the next topic is conflicts of interest, and I've divided this up first by covering what state law provides and then addressing what your ordinance provides. And your ordinance is generally more comprehensive and restrictive than the provisions of state law, but I'll start with what state law provides. First, if any member of the council were to have a ownership interest in an entity that is involved in a question that becomes before the council, they would be precluded from participating in any way on that question as it comes before the council. And when I say any way, and the ownership interest is defined by state law as a 10% interest. So if you were to own 10% stock in a company, or own a sole proprietorship, you would have to recuse yourself from any involvement in that. And that includes voting on the issue, getting involved in the negotiation or award of the contract on behalf of the business, or otherwise attempting to influence the decision. So that's pretty broad. I mean, that means you really shouldn't be even lobbying members of the council as a member of the council. Now, you would still have the right, if it's a issue that involves your company, you obviously still would have the right to present on behalf of the company, but for both conflict of interest purposes and appearance purposes, you shouldn't be sitting with the council if you're doing that. You should remove yourself from the dais and participate as a member of the audience and make very clear that you've abstained and why you've abstained from that consideration. There's a common law test that's a little broader. There's some case law that indicates that municipal officials, if they're placed in a situation of temptation to serve their own personal financial interest to the prejudice of the interests of citizens, then that's a conflict of interest that has to be addressed. And my general view would be to recommend probably the best practice is to abstain from involvement, but it might depend on the specific circumstances what the appropriate way to address that conflict of interest is. And then finally, state law has a pretty broad provision that every municipal official shall attempt to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest by either disclosing that interest and or abstaining from the question as a member of the council. So and I think that's a good rule. The public needs to have confidence in the impartiality of the council. So I generally advise members of municipal bodies to interpret that pretty strictly. So your ordinance, as I said, is broader. it says that a public official shall refrain from participation in a matter when there exists an actual, potential, or reasonably perceived conflict of interest. And it defines a conflict of interest as a situation where a public official cannot participate in a matter because of a personal relationship, financial involvement, or other situation that would cause a reasonable person to believe that the public official cannot act in his or her official capacity without self-interest or bias. Under the ordinance, there's the ability to submit a question to the town ethics committee for an advisory opinion. I think that has rarely occurred, if at all. I don't know if I can remember a specific issue.
I think there was at least once.
Might have happened once.
Years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I think generally the best practice is sort of self-policing on this rather than,
Can you get a little more elaborate in that? Because I know it's been tested.
What's that?
What does self-policing mean?
That members of the council, before they, that they carefully consider whether they have any type of interest that would fall within the definitions in the ordinance, and make the decision themselves rather than bringing it to a point where it needs to go before the ethics committee.
Will we actually get a opportunity to, I'm looking through this actually, to go a little bit more broader on the idea of the policing of the council?
That's why I was asking.
The reason
Just because there's an ethics committee doesn't mean that the council itself can't police those issues.
Yeah.
So you would have the ability as a council to make a determination that one of your members has a conflict and can't participate.
How would that actually lay out? I mean, this is a discussion that's been had by the council over the last couple of years, and I know it's actually written in our charter or ordinance that we are self-policing, but there's really not a whole lot of guidance to go by that. I mean, do other communities have more of a set standard on how that's done? I mean, is it just in an open session, a council member would make a recommendation to the chair that there's a concern, and then it gets brought up that way, or is that? I mean, how do those circumstances usually come to light?
There are some councils, and I don't think I saw it in your rules of procedure, but you could, as part of your rules of procedure, include a process for doing that, and some bodies do that.
Perfect example. I mean, not even example. We have a council member that goes rogue and is actually causing, not just here, but actually out in the town, causing problems. And as a council, we're actually trying to figure out how to put a handle on that.
Yeah.
Show me the steps on how that would actually happen.
I mean, I think what you're right. I mean, I think what you're describing isn't necessarily a conflict of interest.
No, but it's a good time to insert the dialogue.
But
Yeah. I mean, to me, it lays the kind of the same process, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, your authority in that area, if people are concerned about the conduct of a counselor, it's not an issue of whether they are entitled to vote on a question, but
in general.
Yeah. Your ultimate authority probably is to publicly reprimand or censure a member of the council for their conduct.
So is that done through a setting like we are? We actually, I mean, something that wouldn't be on the agenda. I mean, I would assume that it would actually be brought up by a individual councilor, would make a recommendation, and then it would be voted on by the body.
Yeah.
But where does it go from there? I mean, it's one of those things where who are we at that point? Say if it's a 6-1 vote, a 6-0 vote, to tell we're going to sanction that person or actually restrict them from speaking. I mean, what authority do we have at that point to make that happen?
The authority you really have is
none, right?
No. Well, right. I mean,
until it's tested. Until it's tested.
Yeah.
You have everything until it's tested.
Yeah. I mean, you don't. I mean, I guess you don't have the authority to remove an elected official.
Okay.
You don't have a
which is the
authority
full
to
recall.
remove one of your members.
That is the process. The recall is that process.
So your authority really rests in persuasion and what is the best, evaluating what is the action that we can take that is most likely to change
Okay.
And as I understood those, Dan, those were public censure, executive session discussion, have a complaint filed with the ethics committee, and actually have them formalize that piece for the council.
And the ethics committee, the ordinance really isn't geared.
No, there's really
for
no,
this.
there's no set standard
the
from there
ethics-
what you do.
The
and what
ethics
you don't.
ordinance really addresses the stuff I'm talking about, which is the
Right.
conflict of interest and whether you should be voting or abstaining. So it really isn't by ordinance.
That is not a mechanism.
That is not a role of the ethics committee. So it really rests with you as the council to decide, is there some action that we can take
Which is challenging
that
as a
we
council
think
person at
may
that
be
point.
effective in changing the individual?
Without the idea of getting legal involved, it's really difficult because the recommendation from legal would be the idea of us self-policing. But, where does that limit? I'll give you another example that, and it's never happened, I don't believe, but say a member of the council was to be arrested for something that's actually very, very public. And, people, the public are saying, so what's the council going to do? As a council, we're self-policing, but how do we remove, without the idea of going through a full recall of a council that actually, legally you probably really shouldn't be on the council, but the idea of how does that happen? The only reason I'm bringing this up, I'm just wondering if the council needs to look at our rules and actually come up with a better set of standards or process on how that's actually done. I'm sure this happened in other communities, that town council goes out and gets arrested for OUI or doing something crazy, endangerment, and that was in the paper for, some type of abusive conduct. Legally, how do they remove that person without a full recall?
Some have addressed it by charter.
Yeah.
They'll prescribe the authority to remove for certain types of conviction for certain types of offenses.
Yeah.
Is that a minor revision or a major, which forces a charter
I
reform?
think that's a major revision.
Yeah.
That was my opinion,
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
So that's why I asked the
I
question,
think that would have to go to
which is
charter
a whole separate animal.
Right.
So if the council was to vote as a body to actually sanction a person or actually have some type of restrictions, is that binding? Is it if the majority of the council says, Alan, you're no longer able to speak at a meeting, you sit here and you be quiet, you actually can
Good
vote,
luck
but you
enforcing that.
can't speak anymore. Can we enforce that?
Right.
I don't know. That's
Probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
And
idea.
I think there are things you could do by charter if you,
Yeah.
which
Or
would be
legally, you
major
can get a
revisions.
restraining order, and I can't sit within 500 feet of you.
Maybe it just.
So the idea of a reprimand is, the type of action that I'm talking about is really, the idea that perhaps that would be effective to change the individual's behavior. But if the individual chooses to persist, there's,
I've seen other communities where in public the council has actually recommended for a member to step down.
There's some
In public,
language, there's
so.
some language in the charter that says if certain things are violated, they can be suspended for a defined part of the time by the council, and all kinds of stuff in the charter about it, so.
That's actually done by the council.
In my opinion, you call your lawyer.
Well, I hate to say it, but I think we've done that in the past, and it's actually the idea of the process is the biggest question. As we're not lawyers. We're actually just council people, and we're just trying to do the right thing. So.
and you'd want to provide a level of due
Well,
process
it talks about
to the
ethics.
individual
Yeah.
before taking that type of action.
Which again, hopefully it never happens, but it's just one of those things where it's interesting that, and I think a good policy as far as for us self-policing is kind of what the council did when a few years back when the idea of the question was about tardiness, about how many council meetings you can miss before you actually not become a council member, and they actually put a policy in place
and
where
there
it
is some
actually has to be,
language.
there's a policy in place where if you miss X amount of meetings,
Potentially forfeit.
then you forfeit. So I think that is actually kind of that self-policing they're talking about to a certain level. But again, I won't spend any more time on it. I was just kind of curious on where.
Don, did you have another point? We interrupted you several times.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff.
I just want to make sure you didn't have anything else hanging.
Because there is a provision in the charter there for you forfeiture of office if you're, certain
Convicted
things
of a-
like convicted of a crime. or
Convicted of
something. Right.
of a certain type of crime.
Certain types of crime, right. So it's a
Oh,
fairly high bar, but
Yeah.
So when you have a question, you call Dan.
Exactly.
Diane calls Dan.
Yes, exactly.
We request she call David.
Yes.
So I won't go into the town ordinance conflict of interest provision in much further detail, other than to note that it specifically defines what participation in a matter might be, what financial involvement might be, what type of personal relationship might exist that would create a conflict of interest that would require that a council member not participate in the question. And the final conflict of interest topic that I wanted to address was, first, there are some offices that are incompatible with service on the council, either by statute or by case law. An example is the statute provides that you can't simultaneously serve on the council and a municipal board of appeals. Under state law, council members cannot be appointed to any municipal office where they're getting compensation or employment position that was created, or the compensation of which was increased by action of the council during their term, and that ban lasts for a year. The charter, in fact, is broader than that. No council member may hold any other town office or employment by the town, and no former councilor can hold any compensated town office or town employment for 1 year after leaving the council. So it doesn't matter whether the council voted to create the position or voted to increase the compensation. It's a flat-out 1 year ban after serving on the council. Returning to Freedom of Access Act.
Fun. Those are fun.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I guess the issues that I really wanted to highlight on this was, first, executive sessions. There are very specific rules for when you can go into executive session. I think the most common circumstances in which the council would be going into executive session would be to discuss a specific employee or town official where the discussion could affect their reputation or privacy, to consult with legal counsel, to discuss real estate where there could be an issue that would affect the competitive, the ability of the town to negotiate for a property or issues relating to a property, and labor negotiations is something that there's a specific provision that allows you to go into executive session to discuss labor negotiations and proposals. I think those are the most common type of situations that would apply here. There is a provision that allows you to go into executive session to discuss documents that are designated confidential by statute. There needs to be a vote by 3/5 of the council present to enter executive session. There has to be a recitation of the statutory section that you're relying upon to go into executive session. The rule is that information discussed in executive session must be kept confidential, and you can't take any official action or votes in executive session. Touching upon email, the email, my rule is that substantive issues that the council is dealing with shouldn't be discussed by emails. And the reason for that is that could be viewed as circumventing the requirement that the actions of the council are conducted in a public proceeding. So the town manager can send out informational emails to the council, but I strongly advise against having a substantive back and forth on any issues that might be coming before the council. And you should be aware that any email that you send or receive that relate to council business are public documents unless they fall within a confidentiality provision. And that includes emails that are on your own personal email account or on your own personal device. I've got a slide here on social media. The same rule applies. So if you're corresponding by Facebook Messenger on council business, that, again, you shouldn't be discussing substantive issues by text or social media.
Probably shouldn't use WhatsApp either, right?
Exactly. Even though it's encrypted, right?
Yeah, I think it disappears.
And your social media correspondence, again, would also potentially be considered a public record if it relates to town.
Doesn't even have to be correspondence. Three of us chiming into somebody's post is now a public meeting.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I've seen a lot of stuff sometimes on the listserv regarding participation in public meetings. You have to be present to the meeting to participate. You can't do it via an electronic device or Skype or something like that.
There's been a few efforts by the legislature. A few bills have gone before the legislature that have had language that would specifically allow participation remotely under certain circumstances, and those have not passed. So there's some ambiguity in Maine law as to whether it's possible to authorize it. My advice would be to avoid it unless and until there's specific statutory authorization to do it. And if you were to ever consider allowing it, you'd want to have a very detailed policy that, the types of things that you would need to include in a policy. And again, it's not by law. It's of questionable legality, but you would want to have a very specific policy that the individual who's participating remotely has the ability in real time to see everything and see all the documentation and see everybody that is participating in the meeting from a substantive perspective. So that's why particularly because the legislature has looked at it on multiple occasions and has chosen not to approve it, I think you're on thin ice going down that road to allow it. So.
That was one of my personal objectives, to try to get something like that, because every town that I can think of has trouble filling vacancies, and largely because people disappear for a couple months or a month. And so I thought the approach might be to approach the legislature through our legislature. I don't know if that's the way to do it or not, but
I think that's right. I think that's the best solution to get a.
Not that it would go anywhere, but
we could try.
I mean, it does create. There's a lot of. We're a big state, and there's a lot of boards where people are, separated geographically, and
a lot of snowbirds that go south in the winter and aren't around in January and February.
Yeah, exactly. So I agree, Don. It would be good to have a legislative fix on that.
I mean, is there any level of decision making that can actually be done through the council and the town manager without actually being in a session? I mean, being the idea whether it's I know the chair and the town manager can make a decision, but if say tonight's workshop, if there was a number of us that was actually sick, I mean, is there ever a situation where the town manager can actually poll or actually through device actually ask questions and get like an informal vote or from the council? I mean, is there any circumstances, or does that all need to be in a public setting too?
I mean, my answer to that is no.
Okay.
Not that's recognized under the Freedom of Access Act.
Okay.
The business of the council.
Closest we have to that would be we would make the recommendation or the motion that
delegates.
Delegated to the town manager, and then it's fully within her wheelhouse.
Anticipate, right.
Yeah.
That was done in
You
advance.
address it in advance by delegating it to the manager. And that's That's
Well,
really
a lot of times, like, we do a police grant funding too. Receive and allow to spend, so it doesn't have to come back to you to spend it once you got the grant. So it's usually way you craft what's actually
Done
going
on a
for the motion.
previous motion, yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, the idea is you have to be out in public so the public can see you making the decision on camera or, somewhere where they can access it rather than behind closed doors or
Right.
in email between us that they can't see.
Yeah.
It's just not fair
Particularly
to the
because,
public.
the case law and the law itself says that the Freedom of Access Act is to be very strictly construed in favor of sunshine.
Yeah, understandable.
It's, but Alan makes a good point that a way to potentially address that would be to delegate to an individual, to the manager and/or an individual council member authority to do something. But that's generally prospective.
Gotcha. Well planned out, in a sense, yeah.
So my last section is on harassment and discrimination, and I'm not going to get into this extensively because I know you all are going to have or will participate in the online training that is available. But I would note that because you receive some generous compensation from the town, you really are viewed as employees. And to the extent that there are other appointive committees in town that receive compensation as part of their role, you would be considered, and those appointed individuals would be considered employees. And by law, all employees of the town are required to participate in training within a year of their appointment or promotion. Appropriately, the town should be requiring all of you and all appointed officers and board members to participate in that training. And
Now, if there's no compensation for a committee, is there anything we can do to enforce it for a new membership?
for board members that you appoint,
Yep.
and as elected officials yourselves, you are not required to provide compensation for that training under either the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act or Maine law, Maine wage and hour law. I looked at that issue. Those positions, your positions and those appointed positions, are specifically exempted from minimum wage and overtime laws. So you can require, as a condition of serving on those boards, that, and you can and you should require that they do the training, and you are not required to compensate for that.
Yeah, and I have been in the middle of that conversation several times, and because of the planning board and the issues that we've had there. I've read your legal opinion. I'm not sure I agree with it, but
Tom, that hurts.
well, you told me it wasn't tested in court. But when you quoted the Maine statute, you said any person engaged to work on a steady or regular basis, whether full-time or part-time. I've read that statute too, but it doesn't say anything about pay. And that's why I like to feel that sexual harassment training should be done for compensated and uncompensated boards, because the town, I believe, is no less liable for somebody who works in the Conservation Committee than is on the planning board of the town council if somebody makes an inappropriate act or comment or whatever. So that's my position on it, and I wonder what you think.
I'll have to go back and look at the statute to evaluate your critique of my legal analysis.
I wouldn't be far with me. I'm not an attorney, obviously.
Right. Yeah, I'm willing to take another look at it, but the way I read the statute was that there's no basis for requiring for concluding that the town is required to compensate.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about compensating. I'm talking about the...
Required to do it.
I see.
Right.
But it says they're an employee. This statute says they're an employee, but it doesn't say anything about pay. So
I think what he's getting at is these other committees that aren't paid, he would like to see
Oh,
them
you'd
be
like to see
required to
them.
have the same training.
under some method.
Right,
somehow.
we could just require it as a condition for being
Yeah.
appointed to the board, is you agree
Yeah,
to do the
I mean,
training.
Or an
complete it
annual
within a
review by
year
a
or something.
liaison or
Right.
something.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Regardless of whether the state law requires it, I think you can, as a board, as a council, can,
Yeah, that was where we were going.
That requirement.
Is that in our discretion?
yes.
I know some of the boards that have a specific time, like the planning board, you're there for a term, we could just not renew somebody's term afterward
right,
if we were unhappy with that. Or some of them, I think, are at discretion of the council and could just be removed.
Well, almost all of them are discretionary.
Right,
council.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think you have the authority to adopt an ordinance that says, employees that are
Board members, whether or
who
not
are
they're
serving
employees,
on
have to take it.
appointed boards of the town shall participate in training.
Now, is there a certain standard that other communities do as far as for the level of training? I mean, we're picking on one training here about the sexual harassment or harassment in general, discrimination is. I mean, is there
There's
other
certain
municipalities
certain
that actually
things
have-
that need to be covered in the training, and I know that is it MEMIC that you do it? You use an online product from
Right.
MEMIC, and I'm sure it's designed to meet the minimum requirements of the
I
state
think
law.
what his question is there any other type of training that they should be getting
Yeah. I mean,
in
is there-
addition to this?
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
In
is
addition-
there, I mean, if we were to put a policy in place, should it be just the idea of the bare minimum of discrimination or harassment versus the idea of, I guess,
MMA puts one out for new counselors, hires, and that type of stuff regionally, and that type of stuff, that we would include those kinds of things too.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
It's proactive.
yeah, I think it would be helpful for example, planning board members to participate in training that's specific to the conduct of planning boards. And I don't know whether that happens anyway.
There's not every year, but there are
Yeah.
sessions they can go to.
Yeah.
But
I think
freedom
it's
of
mandated right now by our planning board to actually
Yeah.
to require those trainings. I guess
it's
that's
not.
where we're leading to, is the
Yeah.
idea of,
Yeah.
lining up correctly. I mean, you don't want people to have training that actually isn't relevant to what they're doing,
Right.
but in a sense, is there basic training that should be covered by anybody?
There is basic training for the planning board that is done supposedly as a refresher or for new people on it. You wouldn't want to go every year to the thing, but it is something worth requiring, yeah.
So I think I covered the topics that I intended to cover. Be happy to answer more questions, or we talked about having an executive session on a couple of issues as well.
As far as, we actually talked about a few different things as far as for the level of command, but I mean, to me, I think it's very important that actually as councilors realize the difference between a councilor and actually a chairperson and their responsibilities and how that actually flows through. I mean, to me, I've always been understanding, I think from training for you in the past, that basically if a council has a concern pretty much at any level, or if any, it usually is driven through the chair or before. I mean, most things through the council ought to be driven through the chair, whether it's even at a public meeting or the idea of actually going through the town manager, I would imagine, right? I mean, the chair does burden that heaviness of the idea of actually.
Both ways.
Both ways, yeah.
Because it's also the information flow associated with Diane to you folks as a
Yeah.
board.
Going outwards, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I'm not sure if that actually is laid out to be as important as far as what it is, but I mean, the chair does play a big, heavy role as far as for that, and other council people,
Yeah.
whether it's, through a regular meeting or not. I mean, I think the idea of the more that gets funneled through the chair is the more adequate way than actually just individual. I'm not saying individual councils can't actually call and talk to the manager, but it's always better if that's actually worked through the chair, just for procedural wise, I would assume, right?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think you're really talking about sort of best practices, and I do agree that
Well, it's the best way to avoid what we're seeing an item on the agenda and somebody has the what the hell moment. I've never even heard of this, and suddenly it's out of left field. It avoids those kinds of hiccups through the
Yeah.
process, for sure.
Well, as Dan said, we're not anybody if we're not everybody.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and that's the message you've heard in the last 2-3 years sitting here for the same reason. Because a person by themselves is not the entire intent or committee. Nor should it be.
No, unless you're delegated specifically to act
Nor
as the
should
board
it.
for a specific situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else of Dan? Any other questions?
I just appreciate your opportunity, and I appreciate your listening to my disagreement.
Thanks, yeah, even if you don't always agree with me, you appreciate my advice. No, well, thanks. I appreciate working with all of you, so.
Okay, so this concludes the workshop. Next piece, Twyla, would be
Yes, you have no public hearings at 7 o'clock anyway, so maybe you may want to take up your executive session now. So a motion to go into executive session per 1 MRSA Section 4056C,
I need first.
acquisition or disposition
You
of
need to
real
come
estate.
back into meeting first to be able to do that.
Not a
Oh,
workshop.
You need to come.
Okay.
I need to make a motion to come out of workshop.
I'll make a
oh,
motion that
that's
we
new, okay.
go on the workshop.
Second. It was
A
done.
second.
All in favor of that.
Okay.
Now I need the motion to go into executive session for, and you had it.
Did you already go through?
Yep, 4056C, acquisition or disposition of real estate or economic development.
And I could expand that also to add to executive session the 405, Section 6A, personnel, if I said that correctly.
And I'll second that motion.
Thank you. All in favor?
5-0, order passed.
All right, we'll stick next door and then the general
You
public.
want to just go into the training room? There's more chairs in
Four,
there.
perfect, perfect. Thank you.